There is a story that the United States Navy would probably prefer you never heard. It is a story about one of the most powerful warships ever built, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier worth billions of dollars, carrying thousands of sailors and enough air power to project dominance across entire oceans. And then there is the other vessel in this story, a submarine so old it ran on diesel fuel and batteries, a relic of Cold War engineering built in Canada during an era when men were still learning to push the boundaries of underwater warfare. The fact that these two ships ever met in the same patch of ocean and what happened when they did is a lesson in humility that the world's greatest naval force did not see coming. The archive is open. Subscribe to Cold War Black Files and uncover what history tried to hide. The USS Dwight D, in Eisenhower, known to her crew simply as the Ike, is a Nimitz-class supercarrier. She stretches over 1,000 feet from bow to stern, displaces more than 90,000 tons when fully loaded, and is powered by 2 nuclear reactors that give her essentially unlimited range. She carries dozens of aircraft, including fighter jets, electronic warfare planes, helicopters, and early warning aircraft. She travels with an entire battle group, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, all dedicated to protecting her from any possible threat. She is not just a ship. She is a statement, a floating demonstration of what American military power looks like when it decides to show up somewhere in the world. Now consider her opponent. The HMCS Ojibwa was one of 3 Oberon-class submarines acquired by the Royal Canadian Navy in the 1960s. She was built at a British shipyard, launched in 1964, and commissioned into Canadian service in 1968. She ran on diesel-electric propulsion, meaning she had to surface periodically or come to periscope depth to run her engines and recharge her batteries, unlike the nuclear boats that could stay submerged for months at a time. She was roughly 290 feet long, displaced about 2,000 tons submerged, and carried a crew of around 65 men. By the standards of modern naval warfare, she was a museum piece. She was the kind of submarine that her own crews affectionately called a conventional boat, a polite way of acknowledging she belonged to an earlier era of undersea warfare. But here is what the Oberon class had going for it. These submarines were extraordinarily quiet. Diesel-electric submarines, when running on battery power alone with their diesel engines shut down, produce almost no acoustic signature. There are no reactor coolant pumps humming. There are no steam lines vibrating. There is no machinery generating the kind of low-frequency noise that the most sophisticated passive sonar arrays in the world are designed to detect. A diesel submarine running silently on batteries in shallow coastal water, or carefully threading its way through the thermal layers of the open ocean, can become essentially invisible to the sensors designed to track it. The encounter happened during a NATO naval exercise. These exercises were routine events during the Cold War and in the decades that followed, and designed to test interoperability between Allied forces and to practice the kind of coordinated warfare that a real conflict in the North Atlantic would demand. Carrier battle groups would maneuver against opposing forces, simulating the conditions of actual combat. Submarines from Allied nations would play the role of adversaries, attempting to penetrate the defensive screen around the carrier and score a simulated kill. The rules were simple. If you could get close enough, if you could reach a firing position without being detected, you won. The Eisenhower's battle group had every advantage that modern technology could provide. Her escorts were equipped with the latest sonar systems, both hull-mounted arrays and towed arrays that could be streamed behind the ships to listen across vast distances of ocean. There were anti-submarine aircraft circling overhead, dropping sonobuoys and listening for any hint of a submarine contact. There were attack submarines, American nuclear boats, patrolling the outer defense zones to intercept any hostile submarine before it could get close. The battle group had layers upon layers of protection, each one designed to catch anything that might slip through the one before it. The Ojibwa slipped through all of them. The details of exactly how she did it have never been fully declassified, and the Canadian Navy has been characteristically modest in discussing the specifics. But the broad strokes are known. The submarine's commanding officer used a combination of patience, tactical ingenuity, and an intimate understanding of the ocean environment to work his boat past every defensive layer the Americans had deployed. He used the thermal gradient of the water, a natural phenomenon where warmer surface water sits above colder, denser water below, to mask his submarine's acoustic signature from the sonar arrays sweeping the area above him. He moved slowly, minimizing the noise his boat produced. He waited for the right moments when the escorts were focused elsewhere, when the patterns of the battle group's movements created temporary gaps in the coverage. He exploited every natural advantage the ocean offered, and every procedural gap the Americans inadvertently created. When the Ojibwa finally reached her firing position, she was close enough that in a real engagement there would have been no question about the outcome. But she had penetrated the inner defensive screen. She was within torpedo range of the Eisenhower herself. The exercise umpires confirmed the kill. A 1960s-era Canadian diesel submarine had just sunk, at least on paper, one of the most powerful warships in the history of human civilization. The reaction from the American side was complicated. There was the obvious professional embarrassment of having one of their most valuable assets killed by an Allied submarine that was, by any objective measure, technologically inferior. There was a procedural reckoning. After-action reviews, discussions about what gaps in the defensive coverage had allowed the Ojibwa to get through, questions about whether the sonar operators had been too focused on tracking specific contacts and had missed the broader picture. There was the uncomfortable acknowledgement that the kind of threat posed by a quiet diesel submarine was not something that American naval doctrine had adequately accounted for. But there was also, among the professionals who understood what had actually happened, a deep respect for the crew of the Ojibwa and for their commanding officer. What the Canadians had demonstrated was not simply that their submarine was hard to detect. They had demonstrated something far more important, which was that tactical skill and a thorough understanding of the environment can overcome technological disadvantage. The submarine did not win because she was better equipped than the ships hunting her. She won because her crew was better at the specific skill of hiding and stalking than the battle group's crew was at the skill of finding and killing. And this incident was not unique in the broader history of Cold War and post-Cold War naval exercises. Swedish submarines embarrassed American and NATO battle groups on multiple occasions. Australian submarines, also running conventional diesel-electric boats, racked up an impressive record of simulated kills against American carriers. Each time, the pattern was similar. A patient, well-trained crew running a quiet conventional submarine found ways to exploit the gaps in defensive coverage and score kills that the Americans, with all their technological advantages, could not prevent. The implications extended well beyond any single exercise. During the Cold War, the Soviet Navy operated hundreds of submarines, and while many of them were nuclear-powered, a significant number were conventional diesel-electric boats. If Allied submarines were regularly achieving kills against carrier battle groups, that meant Soviet submarines almost certainly had the capability to threaten American carriers in ways that naval planners found deeply uncomfortable to contemplate. The exercises were not just games. They were windows into vulnerabilities that had real strategic consequences. The Ojibwa continued to serve in the Canadian Navy until 1998, when she was decommissioned after 3 decades of service. She is now a museum ship in Port Burwell, Ontario, where visitors can walk through her cramped compartments and get a sense of what life was like for the crews who sailed her. She sits there quietly, as submarines tend to do, without fanfare or dramatic displays. There is no monument outside her hull listing the names of the ships she killed in exercises. There is no sign proclaiming that this modest vessel once humiliated the most powerful navy on Earth during a NATO war game. But the people who know submarines, the people who spent their careers studying the art of underwater warfare, know what she accomplished. The lesson that the Ojibwa taught the US Navy is one that military planners periodically have to relearn. Technology matters enormously in warfare. Training and doctrine matter just as much. But the ocean itself is an equalizer unlike any battlefield on land or in the air. It swallows sound in unpredictable ways. It creates layers and gradients and shadows that can hide a 2,000-ton machine from the most sophisticated sensors ever devised. And a crew that understands those properties deeply enough, that has the patience and the skill to use the ocean as their ally, we can accomplish things that no amount of radar signature or electronic warfare can fully explain or prevent. The Eisenhower still sails. She has been modernized, refueled, and upgraded over the decades since that exercise, and she remains one of the most capable warships in existence. But somewhere in the institutional memory of every sailor who trains for anti-submarine warfare, somewhere in the doctrine manuals and the lessons learned databases and the quiet discussions that happen between exercises, there is a reminder about a Canadian submarine that was older than most of her hunters, quieter than any of them expected, and better at her job than anyone in the American battle group wanted to admit. Declassified but not forgotten. Subscribe for the next revelation.